So, when former Vice President Dick Cheney was laid to rest, the service turned out to be more than just a farewell to a major political figure. It actually held up a mirror to the deep, massive split in American politics. And the story? Well, it wasn't really told by who showed up, but by who was very pointedly told to stay away.
To really get the drama around this funeral, you have to rewind to the feud that pretty much defined Cheney's last few years. I mean, in this 2022 ad he cut for his daughter Liz, he didn't just disagree with Donald Trump. He went right for the jugular. This wasn't just political disagreement anymore. This was all-out war for the very soul of the Republican Party.
And that really brings us to the big question we're digging into here. When a figure as huge and, let's face it, as controversial as Dick Cheney passes on, how does a party that's completely fractured handle it? The answer, as you'll see, tells you everything. All right, so let's start with the event itself. The setting was the Washington National Cathedral, a place steeped in tradition and solemnity. But on this particular day, the political tension in the air was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. It was impossible to ignore. Dick Cheney was 84 years old when he passed away. He'd lived a long life in the public eye and had a very public battle with heart disease for years. His family remembered him as a patriot, the 46th vice president who served during one of the most chaotic periods in modern American history. The second the news broke, the reaction split right down a very specific political line. You had this bipartisan group of former presidents, Bush, Clinton, Obama, Biden, all putting out respectful statements. And then, from the current White House under President Trump, crickets. Total official silence. And that silence, well, it was just a preview of what was to come. Okay, so let's step inside the Washington National Cathedral for a minute, because really, the guest list itself tells you the most important part of this whole political story. Just look at this guest list. It says it all. On one side, you've got the entire political establishment out in full force. George W. Bush, Joe Biden, every single living former vice president. And on the other side, an empty row. The sitting president and vice president, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, were nowhere to be seen. And it's because they weren't invited. And let's be super clear, this wasn't some kind of scheduling conflict or an oversight. This was a statement. The Cheney family very carefully built a guest list that represented a very specific, bipartisan idea of Washington, D.C., an establishment that was united in its opposition to the administration in power. So, inside the cathedral, the focus shifted away from the politics and onto personal memories, painting a picture of the man behind that famous public image. George W. Bush, the man who picked Cheney to be his VP, gave one of the main eulogies. He describes Cheney as his steady, unwavering partner, especially in the chaos after 9/11, a man whose one and only focus was protecting the country. And then, in a really moving tribute, his daughter Liz Cheney shared a much more personal side of him, a family man, a husband whose last words were for his wife. She painted a picture of a man driven by principle and a deep, deep love for his country. So if you look at all the eulogies together, a very specific picture starts to form. A principled leader, a rock during a crisis, and a dedicated family man. This was the Dick Cheney that his friends and family wanted the world to remember. But of course, the biggest story of the whole day was about who wasn't there, and more importantly, why. So let's get into the feud that led to that big empty space in the front row. Look, this conflict wasn't just personal. It was a fundamental ideological fight for the soul of the Republican Party. The Cheneys took a stand for defending traditional institutions and the Constitution, which they saw as being under direct attack by Donald Trump after the 2020 election. This timeline really shows how the split became a complete break. It started with that brutal coward ad back in 2022. Then it escalated like crazy in 2024 when both Cheneys actually crossed party lines to endorse Kamala Harris. And the final chapter? The Trump administration completely breaking with tradition by refusing to issue any formal condolences when he died. 0. That's the number. The number of official White House proclamations President Trump put out to mark the death of a former vice president. Now, flags were lowered by law, but that symbolic gesture from the president himself, it never came. It was the final shot in a long and very bitter political war. So what does all of this add up to? Well, the funeral basically became a moment for the Republican Party to take a long, hard look in the mirror at what it had become. A former aide to George W. Bush just nailed it. They called the service a funeral for the pre-Trump GOP. And man, that quote just captures the bigger meaning perfectly. This wasn't just mourning a person, it was mourning an entire political era that had been completely swept away. And you can see the two clashing visions of the party laid out right here. Cheney represented a version of the GOP that was institutionalist, hawkish, and focused on the establishment, a defender of traditional norms. Trump, on the other hand, represents a populist, America first, anti-establishment movement that's all about challenging those exact same norms. They're just fundamentally at odds. And so Dick Cheney's funeral really became a symbolic end of an era. It was a gathering of ghosts, really, from a version of the Republican Party that, at least for now, doesn't run the show anymore. The people in that cathedral represented the party's past, while the person who wasn't invited, well, he represented its present and its future. Which leaves us with one final big question. Dick Cheney was once one of the most powerful people in his party, period. But by the time of his funeral, he had become a symbol of the opposition from within. So what happens to a political party when it can no longer even agree on who its heroes are or how to properly say goodbye to them?